For numerous Americans, the event at Appomattox signifies the conclusion of the Civil War. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee yielded his forces to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, marking what seemed to be the finale of the four-year American Civil War. Despite this, it would be an additional 16 months before President Andrew Johnson formally announced the conflict's termination in August 1866. Appomattox was undeniably a critical victory for the Union, and the peace accord Grant established with Lee became a model for other generals throughout the nation. So, what caused the prolonged delay before an official declaration? The sequence of events culminating in the war's end started with Lee's Appomattox campaign. This final offensive by General Lee commenced on March 25, 1865, with a Confederate assault on Fort Stedman, located near Petersburg. Just 1 week later, on April 1st, troops under General Grant counterattacked at Five Forks, compelling Lee to abandon Richmond and Petersburg the following day. The Confederate Army's withdrawal proceeded southwest, tracking the Richmond and Danville Railroad. Lee was desperately searching for a supply train for his men, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Recognizing that Lee's army had exhausted its options, Grant sent a letter to Lee on April 7th demanding his surrender. Grant communicated to Lee that the outcomes of the preceding week should persuade him of the futility of continued resistance by the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee replied, indicating he did not share Grant's appraisal of his army's capacity to fight on. Nevertheless, he inquired about the conditions Grant was proposing. In the meantime, Union General Philip Sheridan's cavalry, accompanied by two rapidly advancing infantry corps, moved from Farmville in central Virginia, reaching Appomattox Station ahead of Lee and cutting off his path on April 8th. The next morning, Lee found Union cavalry and infantry positioned ahead of him, with two additional Union corps closing in from behind. Confederate General John B. Gordon's forces charged the Federal cavalry, but Gordon soon understood that without substantial support from other Confederate units, his position was untenable. Upon receiving this report and acknowledging his retreat was blocked, Lee asked for a meeting with Grant to discuss surrendering his army. He subsequently requested a ceasefire while the surrender negotiations were finalized. Grant stipulated that all Confederate soldiers, with the exception of officers, were to surrender their weapons and could return home after signing documents of parole. Lee accepted the terms, prompting Grant to draft the official agreement. One issue Lee raised before the terms were signed involved the matter of horses. He noted that, in contrast to the Union troops, the Confederate cavalry and artillerymen in his command owned their horses personally. Grant answered that while this wouldn't be formally written into the agreement, he would instruct that the men be permitted to keep their animals. Lee also brought up the subject of food, as his troops had gone without rations for days. Grant consented to supply 25,000 meals to the hungry Confederate soldiers. Although it represented the most significant surrender of the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee had only capitulated with his Army of Northern Virginia. As Mary Custis Lee stated regarding her husband, General Lee is not the entire Confederacy. Her evaluation was correct because the Confederate cause persisted. The army of General Joseph E. Johnston, which was the second largest after Lee's, remained active in North Carolina. Lieutenant General Richard Taylor commanded forces in Alabama, Mississippi, and sections of Louisiana. The troops of Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith were stationed west of the Mississippi River, and Brigadier General Stan Watie commanded a Native American unit in the far western territories. Nathan Bedford Forrest's men were dispersed across Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. Joseph Johnston and his army learned of Lee's surrender on April 12th while in North Carolina. After the Battle of Bentonville, Johnston's Confederate forces had diminished to approximately 30,000 troops. This number constituted about half the size of Sherman's Union command. A few days later, Major General John Schofield's Union Army reinforced Sherman at Goldsboro, swelling the total Union strength to nearly 80,000 soldiers. With Grant no longer engaged with Lee in Virginia, the combined Union forces of Grant and Sherman could focus their assaults on Johnston's isolated Confederate army. The following day, the Union cavalry under General William Sherman advanced, driving Johnston's soldiers westward. Facing relentless pressure from Sherman, Johnston attempted to negotiate a peace settlement. After an initial agreement that offered considerable political concessions to the South was rejected by the newly inaugurated President Johnson and his cabinet, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered Johnston to resume hostilities. Johnston refused, knowing his situation was hopeless. On April 26th, Sherman and Johnston signed a new surrender document, mirroring the terms Grant and Lee had agreed upon at Appomattox. Sherman notified Johnston that, in the largest surrender of the Civil War, he was capitulating with over 90,000 soldiers in total, effectively all remaining Confederate troops in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. When news of Johnston's surrender reached Alabama, a chain reaction began. Lieutenant General Richard Taylor commanded roughly 10,000 men in the Confederate Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana. The city of Mobile, Alabama, had already yielded to Union troops in mid-April, following Union victories at two forts defending the city. This development, combined with the news of Johnston's negotiations with Sherman, led Taylor to seek a meeting with his Union opposite, Major General Edward Canby. On May 2nd, the two generals convened a few miles north of Mobile. After agreeing to a 48-hour armistice, the commanders even shared an outdoor picnic with food, drinks, and lively music. Canby presented Taylor with the same conditions agreed upon by Lee and Grant. Taylor accepted these terms and officially relinquished his command on May 4th at Citronelle, Alabama. Several days later in Gainesville, Alabama, Nathan Bedford Forrest surrendered his cavalry corps, telling his men, "We are beaten is a self-evident fact, and any further resistance on our part would justly be regarded as the very height of folly and rashness." On May 10th, Union forces apprehended Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Irwinville, Georgia. Yet, the South was not fully defeated. Even after these surrenders, and after Union troops captured the fleeing Davis, and President Johnson stated on May 10th that the South's military resistance could be considered virtually over, combat continued fiercely west of the Mississippi River. On May 12th, near Brownsville, Texas, 350 Confederates under Colonel John Rip Ford attacked 800 Union soldiers, led by Colonel Theodore H. Barrett at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, the final land engagement of the Civil War. It was largely a conflict of Texans versus other Texans. It wasn't an enormously significant battle, but it retains its status as the last notable fight of the Civil War. By this time, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi under Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith, the last major Confederate force still active, had started to disintegrate. When news of Appomattox spread, a massive desertion occurred from its ranks. Smith was essentially a general in title only, as he commanded very few troops. On May 26th, Smith surrendered his command in Galveston. Brigadier General Stan Watie, the first Native American to become a Confederate general, kept his forces in the field for more than a month after Smith capitulated. On June 23rd, Watie finally conceded defeat and surrendered his Confederate Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and Osage troops at Dokesville, near Fort Towson, making him the last Confederate general to lay down his command. The CSS Shenandoah, originally a British merchant vessel converted into a Confederate raider in 1864, continued to attack Union commercial shipping in the Bering Sea long after land hostilities had ceased. The ship's mission was to plunder New England's whaling fleets, so the Shenandoah hunted Yankee whalers. Since the ship's crew remained unaware that the war had concluded, the Shenandoah proceeded to harass Union vessels in the Bering Sea and the Arctic Ocean. By August 1865, the Shenandoah had captured or destroyed 38 ships, including whalers and merchant vessels. It was only in August 1865 that the ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander James Waddell, received confirmation the war was officially over. The ship then stowed its cannon and made a covert journey to Liverpool, England, where it lowered its large Confederate flag for the final time. On April 2, 1866, President Johnston made a proclamation stating that the rebellion had concluded in all former Confederate states except for Texas, which had not yet formed a compliant state government. Because the war had a far less severe impact on Texas's economy, land, and infrastructure compared to the rest of the South, many former Confederates from other states migrated there in the post-war months. These waves of newly arrived white Southerners would soon clash with another growing demographic in the state: freed slaves. In June, after President Johnson approved Texas's new constitution, which provided limited civil rights to black people, statewide elections were organized. On August 9th, conservative Unionist James Webb Throckmorton was inaugurated as governor. On August 20th, 1866, acknowledging Texas's new state government, Johnson was at last able to declare that the said insurrection was ended and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole United States of America. This marked the official end of the Civil War. If you found this deep dive into the complex end of the Civil War enlightening, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to Rootvolutionary for more content that challenges the simplified narratives of history. Thanks for watching.